Intelligence without wisdom is perhaps the most dangerous gift our modern age bestows upon its children. I have spent decades observing brilliant minds capable of solving complex mathematical theorems, crafting elegant prose, mastering multiple languages, yet remaining fundamentally immature in their understanding of life's deepest truths. These individuals accumulate knowledge like collectors gathering artifacts, but they never learn to contemplate, never learn to integrate, never learn to transform mere information into lived wisdom. The distinction is crucial, my friends. Intelligence is the capacity to acquire and manipulate information. Wisdom is the virtue that orders all knowledge toward truth and goodness. One can be intellectually gifted yet remain spiritually and morally stunted. This is not merely an academic observation, it is a tragedy I witness daily in our universities, in our public discourse, in the very fabric of our intellectual culture. Today, I wish to share with you why this happens, and more importantly, how we might cultivate that rare synthesis between intellectual brilliance and contemplative wisdom that transforms both mind and soul. For in truth, the multiplication of clever but unwise persons may be the greatest threat to authentic human flourishing in our time. We have created a generation that knows much but understands little, that can analyze everything but contemplate nothing, that possesses impressive technical skills but lacks the fundamental orientation toward truth that alone can make such skills serve human good rather than human destruction. Chapter 1: The Illusion of Intellectual Sufficiency. Modern education has created what I call the illusion of intellectual sufficiency, the dangerous belief that accumulating facts and developing analytical skills constitutes complete intellectual formation. This illusion seduces many of our brightest minds into believing that intelligence alone is sufficient for understanding reality. It is, perhaps, the most subtle and destructive form of pride that afflicts the contemporary world. I have observed this phenomenon countless times in my years at the École Pratique de Hautes Études. Students arrive with remarkable intellectual gifts, sharp analytical minds, vast memories, impressive linguistic abilities. They can dissect complex arguments, synthesize diverse sources, and articulate sophisticated positions with remarkable facility. Yet when faced with life's fundamental questions, questions of meaning, purpose, virtue, and ultimate truth, they often respond with the same superficiality as those with far lesser intellectual gifts. The problem lies not in their intelligence, but in their formation. They have been trained to collect and analyze, but never taught to contemplate and integrate. They approach every question as a problem to be solved rather than a mystery to be entered. This reduces the life of the mind to a merely technical operation, devoid of the contemplative dimension that transforms knowledge into wisdom. The result is what we might call intellectual virtuosity without intellectual virtue, impressive mental performance that lacks the moral and spiritual foundation necessary for authentic understanding. Consider the student who can explain every philosophical argument for God's existence but has never spent a quiet hour in genuine prayer or contemplation. He possesses intellectual knowledge about divine reality but lacks the experiential wisdom that comes only through patient, humble seeking. His intelligence, however impressive, cannot bridge the gap between conceptual understanding and lived truth. He knows about God but does not know God, and this distinction makes all the difference between clever superficiality and authentic wisdom. This intellectual pride, for that is what it truly is, prevents the very humility necessary for wisdom. The intelligent person begins to believe that his mind alone is sufficient for understanding reality. He loses the childlike wonder and docility necessary for receiving truth as gift rather than achievement. Consequently, his intelligence becomes a barrier rather than a pathway to wisdom, creating what the tradition calls learned ignorance, of the worst kind, not the blessed recognition of mystery that characterizes the mystic, but the tragic blindness that mistakes partial understanding for comprehensive knowledge. The result is what we might call intellectual autism, a condition where the mind becomes increasingly sophisticated in its operations while simultaneously becoming more isolated from the deeper dimensions of reality that can only be apprehended through contemplative receptivity and humble acknowledgement of our fundamental dependence upon truth that transcends our individual comprehension. Chapter 2: The Fragmentation of Knowledge Without Contemplation. Intelligence without contemplation inevitably leads to the fragmentation of knowledge, a condition where the mind accumulates vast amounts of information without ever discovering the underlying unity that transforms mere facts into coherent wisdom. This fragmentation is perhaps the most characteristic mark of our age, and it represents a profound departure from the integrated vision that characterized the greatest minds of previous centuries. The intelligent but uncontemplative mind approaches each field of knowledge as a separate domain, hermetically sealed from every other domain. Science remains disconnected from philosophy, philosophy from theology, art from morality, practical skills from spiritual development. The person may achieve remarkable expertise in multiple areas while remaining fundamentally confused about how these various truths relate to one another and to the whole of human existence. This creates what we might call archipelagos of knowledge, scattered islands of expertise surrounded by vast oceans of ignorance about the connections that alone give meaning to particular insights. I have encountered brilliant scientists who cannot understand how their discoveries might relate to questions of meaning and purpose, as if the natural world they study with such precision existed in complete isolation from the human world they inhabit. Gifted historians who see only succession of events without grasping the deeper patterns that reveal something of providence and human nature. Talented artists who create beautiful works while remaining morally and spiritually impoverished, as if beauty could be divorced from truth and goodness without losing its essential character. In each case, intelligence operates in isolation from the contemplative vision that alone can integrate diverse truths into coherent wisdom. The person becomes like a scholar who has memorized vast portions of a great library but has never discovered the organizing principle that reveals how all the books relate to one another and contribute to a unified understanding of reality. This fragmentation creates what we might call learned ignorance, of the worst kind, not the blessed ignorance of the mystic who recognizes the limits of conceptual knowledge, but the tragic ignorance of the intellectual who mistakes his specialized knowledge for comprehensive understanding. Such individuals often become prisoners of their own expertise, unable to see beyond the narrow confines of their particular discipline, yet convinced that their limited perspective provides adequate access to the whole of reality. The contemplative approach, by contrast, always seeks the underlying unity that connects all genuine knowledge. It recognizes that all authentic insights participate in the one truth that is their source and goal. The contemplative mind naturally seeks to understand how the insights of science illuminate the wisdom of philosophy, how both relate to the truths of faith, how all together contribute to a more complete understanding of reality and our place within it. Chapter 3: The Velocity Problem, Speed versus Depth. Our age suffers from what I call the velocity problem, the mistaken belief that intellectual excellence consists in the speed of processing information rather than the depth of understanding truth. This cultural emphasis on speed fundamentally corrupts the relationship between intelligence and wisdom, creating minds that are agile but shallow, responsive but unreflective, efficient but ultimately sterile. The intelligent person of our time is systematically rewarded for quick responses, rapid analysis, immediate solutions. Our educational systems prize the student who can quickly identify the correct answer, rapidly complete assignments, efficiently process large volumes of material. Our professional environments reward those who can provide instant expertise, immediate solutions, rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. Even our intellectual culture celebrates the scholar who can produce quick insights, clever observations, and rapid-fire analysis of complex issues. This velocity-based approach to intellectual life creates minds that are quick but shallow, agile but unstable, responsive but unreflective. Such minds become like shallow streams, They flow rapidly over the surface of reality but carry little depth, make much noise but possess little power to nourish the deeper needs of human existence. They can process vast quantities of information but cannot transform information into understanding, understanding into wisdom, or wisdom into contemplative participation in truth itself. Contemplation, by its very nature, requires what our age has forgotten, the patient art of lingering. To contemplate means to remain present to a truth long enough for it to reveal its deeper dimensions, to penetrate our understanding not merely at the surface level of conceptual analysis but at the deeper level of personal transformation. This requires time, patience, and the humility to recognize that the most important truths cannot be quickly mastered but must be slowly received, gradually assimilated, and patiently integrated into the fabric of one's entire existence. I have observed that many of our most intelligent contemporaries have lost the capacity for this patient receptivity. They approach every text, every idea, every question with the assumption that quick analysis will yield complete understanding. They read rapidly, think efficiently, conclude definitively, and in doing so, they miss entirely the transformative dimension of genuine intellectual engagement. They become like tourists rushing through a great cathedral, taking photographs of everything but experiencing nothing. The wise person, by contrast, knows that understanding deepens with time and contemplation. He approaches great texts not as problems to be solved but as mysteries to be entered gradually, reverently, with the expectation that repeated encounter will yield ever deeper insights. He reads slowly, thinks reflectively, and remains open to transformations that may only emerge through patient, sustained engagement with truths that transcend his initial comprehension. Chapter 4: The Pride That Prevents Reception. Perhaps the greatest obstacle preventing intelligent people from becoming wise is intellectual pride, the subtle but profound conviction that one's mental abilities make one self-sufficient in the pursuit of truth. This pride is particularly seductive to the intelligent because it masquerades as legitimate confidence in one's abilities, making it extremely difficult to recognize and even more difficult to overcome. The intelligent person naturally experiences repeated success in academic and professional environments. He solves problems others cannot solve, grasps concepts others find difficult, articulates insights others struggle to express, demonstrates competencies that earn recognition and advancement. These repeated experiences of intellectual success gradually foster a dangerous self-reliance, the unconscious assumption that his mind alone is adequate for understanding any question that might arise, that his analytical abilities provide sufficient access to the fullness of reality. This pride manifests in countless subtle ways that often escape the notice of the person himself. The intelligent person approaches new ideas with the assumption that he can quickly determine their value rather than with the humility to consider that he might have something fundamental to learn. He engages in discussions primarily to demonstrate his understanding rather than to deepen it through genuine dialogue. He reads great authors to confirm his existing insights rather than to be challenged, corrected, or transformed by encounter with truth beyond his current comprehension. Most destructively, intellectual pride prevents the receptive posture essential for wisdom. Wisdom comes as gift, not achievement. It requires what the classical tradition calls docility, not the weakness of those easily influenced by passing opinions, but the strength of those confident enough in truth itself to remain genuinely open to receiving it from any authentic source. The proud intellect cannot receive because it is too busy asserting, too concerned with displaying its own capabilities to notice the fundamental limitations that make learning both necessary and possible. I have seen brilliant theologians who approach sacred texts as problems to be analyzed rather than as living word to be received with reverent attention. Gifted philosophers who engage great thinkers of the past as opponents to be defeated in intellectual combat rather than as potential teachers to be heard with respectful consideration. Talented scientists who view the natural world primarily as raw material for human manipulation rather than as creation to be contemplated with wonder, reverence, and grateful acknowledgement of its intrinsic intelligibility. In each case, intelligence operates within the closed circle of its own assumptions and capabilities, never genuinely opening itself to the transformative encounter with truth that alone can mature intelligence into wisdom. The person remains clever but not wise, informed but not transformed, competent within narrow spheres but fundamentally confused about the deeper questions that give meaning and direction to all particular competencies. This intellectual pride creates what we might call the competence trap. The more competent one becomes within particular domains, the more difficult it becomes to maintain the humility necessary for continued learning and growth toward authentic wisdom. Chapter 5: The Absence of Spiritual Discipline. Wisdom cannot develop without spiritual discipline, yet most intelligent people of our time have been formed to believe that intellectual development requires no corresponding development of character, no cultivation of virtue, no practice of spiritual disciplines that purify the heart and prepare it to receive truth. This represents a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature and constitutes perhaps the most serious defect in contemporary approaches to intellectual formation. This separation of intellectual and spiritual development reflects a fragmented anthropology that sees the human person as a collection of separate faculties rather than as an integrated unity of body, soul, mind, and spirit. The intellect does not operate in isolation from the will, the emotions, the moral dispositions, and the spiritual orientation of the whole person. Our capacity to perceive and understand truth is profoundly affected by the condition of our souls, the ordering of our desires, and the fundamental direction of our lives. Pride obscures truth by making us resistant to insights that challenge our self-image or threaten our sense of intellectual superiority. Inordinate desire distorts perception by making us see only what serves our immediate interests rather than what actually exists. Moral compromise corrupts judgment by forcing us to rationalize behaviors that we know, at some level, to be wrong. Spiritual chaos creates intellectual confusion by depriving the mind of the peace and stability necessary for sustained contemplation of truth. The contemplative tradition has always recognized that the pursuit of wisdom requires the simultaneous cultivation of intellectual and moral virtue. The person who seeks to understand must also seek to become good. The mind that would apprehend truth must be supported by a will oriented toward goodness and a heart purified through spiritual discipline. This is not an optional addition to intellectual formation but an essential component of it, for truth itself is not merely an object to be analyzed but a reality to be participated in through the whole of one's existence. Yet modern educational formation typically ignores this integration entirely. Students are trained to develop their analytical abilities while their moral and spiritual formation is left to chance, relegated to separate spheres of life, or dismissed as irrelevant to serious intellectual work. The result is the development of powerful intellectual instruments wielded by spiritually underdeveloped persons, a dangerous combination that often produces intelligence in service of disordered desires rather than wisdom in service of truth and human flourishing. I have encountered numerous individuals with impressive intellectual achievements whose personal lives reveal profound moral confusion, emotional immaturity, and spiritual emptiness. Their intelligence has outpaced their wisdom not because they lack mental ability but because they have never undertaken the patient work of character formation that alone can create the interior conditions necessary for receiving and integrating truth at the deepest levels of human existence. The wise person, by contrast, understands that intellectual development must be accompanied by spiritual development. He practices contemplative disciplines not as separate religious exercises but as essential components of serious intellectual formation. Prayer, meditation, examination of conscience, the cultivation of virtue, these are not optional additions to intellectual life but necessary foundations for it. Chapter 6: The Cultural Reinforcement of Intellectual Superficiality. Our contemporary culture systematically reinforces the very attitudes and practices that prevent intelligent people from developing wisdom. Understanding these cultural influences is essential for anyone who would resist them and pursue the deeper integration of intelligence and contemplation that characterizes authentic intellectual maturity. Modern academic culture rewards specialization over integration, innovation over reception of tradition, critical analysis over contemplative understanding. The scholar who questions everything is praised as intellectually courageous, while the one who seeks primarily to understand and receive great truths is viewed with suspicion as intellectually passive. Original thinking is valued above wise thinking, cleverness above depth, productivity above contemplation, publication above formation. This creates an environment where young intellectuals learn to approach the great tradition of human wisdom primarily as raw material for their own original contributions rather than as a source of insights that might fundamentally challenge and transform their understanding. They are trained to find problems with great texts rather than to discover what those texts might teach them. They learn to demonstrate their intellectual independence rather than to cultivate the intellectual humility that makes genuine learning possible. Professional environments further reinforce these values through reward systems that prioritize speed, efficiency, and measurable output over depth, wisdom, and contemplative understanding. The intelligent person is rewarded for providing quick solutions, efficient analysis, innovative approaches that can be immediately implemented. Contemplative reflection appears unproductive, spiritual concerns seem irrelevant to professional success, and the patient work of character formation looks like a luxury that busy professionals cannot afford. Media culture compounds these influences by creating an environment of constant stimulation that makes contemplative reflection increasingly difficult to sustain. The intelligent person becomes accustomed to rapid shifts of attention, immediate access to vast quantities of information, and instant entertainment that provides continuous distraction from the interior silence necessary for deep thinking. This conditions the mind to expect immediate gratification and makes the patient, sustained attention required for contemplation feel uncomfortable, unnatural, and ultimately impossible to maintain. Even religious culture often contributes to the problem by separating spiritual formation from intellectual development, creating the impression that one can pursue God without serious engagement with truth, or pursue truth without serious engagement with God. This artificial separation impoverishes both intellectual and spiritual life, preventing the integration that alone can produce the kind of wisdom our world desperately needs. The cumulative effect of these cultural influences is the creation of intelligent individuals who have never been exposed to credible models of integrated wisdom, who have never been seriously invited to consider that their intellectual gifts might require spiritual development to reach their full potential, and who have been systematically trained in habits of mind and heart that prevent rather than promote the contemplative receptivity essential for authentic wisdom. Recognizing these cultural influences is the first step toward effective resistance. The person who would develop wisdom must consciously choose countercultural practices, associations, and rhythms of life that support rather than undermine the contemplative dimension of intellectual existence. Chapter 7: The Path from Intelligence to Wisdom. Having examined why so many intelligent people fail to develop wisdom, we must now consider the positive path by which intelligence can be transformed into wisdom through the cultivation of contemplative habits and spiritual disciplines. This transformation is neither automatic nor easy, but it is possible for anyone willing to undertake the patient work of integral formation. The first requirement is humility, not the false humility that undervalues one's gifts or pretends to incompetence, but the true humility that recognizes intelligence itself as gift received rather than achievement earned. This humility creates the receptive posture necessary for learning, the openness to truth that can come from sources beyond one's current understanding, and the docility that allows great teachers and great texts to actually teach rather than merely confirm existing opinions or provide material for intellectual manipulation. The second requirement is the cultivation of contemplative practices that slow down the velocity of intellectual activity and create interior space for deeper penetration of truth. This means learning to read slowly and reflectively, allowing texts to work on us rather than simply working on them. It means learning to think patiently rather than quickly, remaining present to questions long enough for them to reveal dimensions that escape hasty analysis. It means developing tolerance for uncertainty, comfort with mystery, and appreciation for the gradual unfolding of understanding over years rather than moments. The third requirement is the integration of intellectual and spiritual development through practices that engage both mind and heart in the unified pursuit of truth. Prayer becomes not an interruption of intellectual work but its foundation and culmination, the place where we acknowledge our dependence upon truth beyond ourselves and open ourselves to receive insights that transcend our individual capabilities. The study of great texts becomes not merely academic exercise but spiritual formation, as we allow ourselves to be challenged and transformed by encounter with minds greater than our own. The fourth requirement is the patient cultivation of virtue, particularly the intellectual virtues of studiositas, humility, and patience, but also the moral virtues that create the interior conditions necessary for wisdom. The person cannot become wise while remaining fundamentally proud, lustful, greedy, wrathful, or envious. Character formation is not optional for intellectual formation but essential to it, for the condition of the soul profoundly affects the mind's capacity to perceive and understand truth. The fifth requirement is the conscious choice of associations and influences that support rather than undermine contemplative intellectual life. This means seeking mentors who embody the integration of intelligence and wisdom, engaging regularly with texts and traditions that have proven their capacity to form wise persons over centuries rather than merely clever ones over decades, and creating rhythms of life that include regular periods of silence, solitude, and contemplative reflection. The sixth requirement is the development of what we might call contemplative courage, the willingness to pursue truth wherever it leads, even when it challenges our comfortable assumptions or demands changes in our way of life. Many people remain trapped in intellectual superficiality not because they lack ability but because they lack the courage to follow their insights to their logical and existential conclusions. Finally, the transformation of intelligence into wisdom requires patience with the slowness of genuine formation. Wisdom develops gradually through years of patient practice, sustained by faith in the value of contemplative discipline even when its effects are not immediately apparent. Conclusion. The tragedy of our age is not the lack of intelligent people, but the rarity of wise ones. We have created systems of education and culture that can produce brilliant analysts, skilled technicians, and clever manipulators of information, but we have largely forgotten how to form contemplative minds capable of receiving and integrating truth at the deepest levels of human existence. This situation is not inevitable, though it has become deeply entrenched in our cultural assumptions and institutional practices. Intelligence can become wisdom, but only through the patient cultivation of contemplative disciplines that our age has largely abandoned in favor of more immediately productive and measurable forms of mental activity. The path I have outlined requires humility, patience, spiritual discipline, and the courage to resist cultural pressures that reduce intellectual life to mere technical competence. It demands the integration of mind and heart, intelligence and virtue, analysis and contemplation, individual development and service to truth that transcends individual interests. For those willing to undertake this deeper formation, the rewards extend far beyond personal development and professional success. Our world desperately needs wise persons, individuals who combine intellectual gifts with contemplative depth, analytical skill with spiritual maturity, professional competence with moral wisdom and genuine understanding of what serves authentic human flourishing. Such persons become sources of genuine insight capable of addressing not merely technical problems but the deeper questions of human meaning, purpose, and destiny. They serve as bridges between the fragmented specializations of contemporary knowledge and the integrated wisdom that humanity needs to navigate the complex challenges of our time. the choice is before each of us. Will we remain content with the clever superficiality that our culture rewards and celebrates? Or will we have the courage and patience to pursue the contemplative depth that transforms intelligence into wisdom? The path is ancient, proven, and always available to those humble enough to begin and persevering enough to continue through the slow but ultimately transformative work of integral intellectual formation.